this is Brian Rowe with Mythic MTG Tech number 201. In the middle of spoiler season, we got a treat from the DCI. They are changing the Mulligan rules, or at least severely looking at changing the Mulligan rules, so much that they are rolling out a new Mulligan rule for the next Pro Tour that could possibly go live to all events after that. So today I'm going to talk about first the new Mulligan rule, and second, tips to mulliganing generally, because mulliganing is one of those things that I see a lot of people really screw up at all different levels of Magic, and not enough people really talk about what the best practices are. It can mean the difference between winning and losing, especially in Game 2 and Game 3 when you talk about older formats. Here is the current Mulligan rule with the addition here in red for the next Pro Tour. Let's look at that addition after we talk for a second about the Mulligan rule. Basically, currently, to mulligan, you can choose to shuffle your cards back in at any time before the beginning of the first game and draw one less card each time that you do that. You can do that all the way down to 0 cards. When you've decided to stop mulliganing, you can't then decide to mulligan again. Each person goes from 7 to 6 to 5 together, so you can't wait to see how low your opponent mulligans before you decide if you're going to take your mulligan. This is called the Paris Mulligan. I'm not sure exactly why. I'll look into that history at another point in time. My guess is it was debuted at a Paris Pro Tour. The new rule that is in effect for the next Pro Tour is after you've mulliganed, if you have less than that 7-card opening hand, you may scry 1. You can look at the top card of your library and decide to leave it on top or put it on the bottom. This is great. It helps individuals who have suffered from a mulligan to get back into the game. As I mentioned, this is not live yet. It's being tested at the next Pro Tour. I will definitely do a video if it does go live for everyone except the Pro Tour players, or everyone including the Pro Tour players. This is dealing with one of the issues that most other card games have dealt with. Magic was really the first, and they screwed up in some areas. And one of those areas is having an occasional game where absolutely one player destroys the other because the other is just looking for land. That's no fun for either side. I don't mind losing. I do mind losing when I don't get to cast a single spell throughout the game. Kaijudo, Hex, the World of Warcraft trading card game, and Hearthstone all had different ways of fixing this particular problem while leaving randomness in the game. I like most of those fixes. I don't see Magic moving to any of those really good fixes because there's such a history behind land and having to build decks with the right mana curve in them. But this rule does move in the right direction to mitigating the issues that somebody runs into when they just can't draw any land. So I'm super happy about this rule. It should mean more competitive games where both players get to cast spells. It does slightly benefit some obscene decks out there, such as Dredge in Vintage, where I've played against people who've mulliganed to 0, and they would even use that last scry as a positive to try to find that Bazaar of Baghdad. For most decks, this is going to be very negligible. It's going to be a very small minor advantage, but both players get the chance to take advantage of it. It is going to make fetch lands better on the play. You will be able to decide whether or not to fetch early on. You'll have already possibly put something to the bottom or know what that top card is on top. That little bit of extra information is definitely useful when you have the ability to reshuffle your deck. If you have a situational card on top, you can wait to see what your opponent plays before deciding to fetch or draw that card. That seems very valuable in a few edge cases. Now we're on to the basic tips for mulliganing. Number 1, new players hate to mulligan. Do not be afraid of mulligans. I have won many games with 6, 5, and even 4 card hands, where the 7 card hand I started with would have never ever gotten me there. It is a privilege to mulligan. You get to get rid of the junk that you have to get a better hand. You have to change that mindset, even that mindset that permeated the beginning of this video where I talk about mulligans negatively, and turn mulligans into something positive, especially when you're looking for sideboard cards that are going to save the game for you. One of the few articles that I found out there written on mulligans that deals with mulligans generally is over 10 years old. This is by Krouner. I don't think he even writes or plays anymore, but one of the pieces of advice I pulled out of this article was, when in doubt, throw it out. If you don't believe that your opening hand is good, or you're really questionable about it, when you're getting into learning how to mulligan and get the idea of what it feels like to have those 6 and 5 card hands. You always want to be looking for a hand that you can put together a particular game plan with. He outlines a bunch more questions that you ask yourself. A lot of those are dependent on the particular deck that you're playing in, that he goes over in this article. I'm not going to cover all of those because a lot of them are very deck specific. A very good piece of advice that also came up on Magic the Scattling is from Star City Games writer Gary Thompson. Look at your hand and decide, can I win with this hand? Not, do I have lands and spells? That's a common mistake that I see, is people look at, can I cast spells? That's different from having a winning game plan. And what you want out of a hand is a winning game plan. If this is red deck wins, you've got a nice curve there. You've got a lot of damage coming in. If this is a control deck, you're hitting your land drops. You've got those Scry lands in place, and you've got an answer in case there's that early aggression. But it's coming up with that winning plan. And if you see that winning plan manifested in that hand, keep it. If you can't see a way to win, especially game 2 and game 3, when you've got a lot of information about your opponent's deck, you got to ship that hand and look for that winning game plan. Another thing to really look at, and this is a huge mistake I see a lot of people make, is just because a hand actually won you a game does not mean it was a good hand. If you take the results of a particular game and superimpose that on whether or not you should keep a hand, it can actually encourage you to keep some really sketchy hands. I've definitely seen players get really lucky playing decks like Rug Delver, where they're taking really bad hands and they get lucky and they top deck into a Brainstorm that fixes their whole hand, and then they think that the hand was actually good. You want to evaluate your hand independent of what the outcome was in the game. Whenever you have a new deck that you're playing, go out there, see if you can find some examples from pros where they talk about Mulligan specifically with that deck. This is Jacob Wilson talking about the Rug Delver deck and whether or not he would keep certain hands. He specifically covers the difference between Gataxian Probe and Ponder or Brainstorm in this situation. This type of deep knowledge of how to mulligan for a particular deck, you're only going to find if you can find a pro talking about that deck that you've just put together and their experiences with it. Reid Duke has a wonderful series over on Wizards of the Coast site. It's a several-part series on mulligans, and he emphasizes that plan to win. Do you have all of the pieces that you need to make a successful winning plan? And he has many examples as part of that. I strongly suggest checking out Reid Duke's wonderful articles over on Wizards of the Coast site. Each format has different requirements for mulligans. If you learn how to mulligan in one format, you need to reevaluate that when you get to the next. Standard is traditionally a very slow format. If you happen to be in a very fast version of Standard, it may be similar to what you see in Modern, but Modern has a much broader group of answer cards in your sideboard. So your game 2 and your game 3 may have things like Stony Silence that can just blow out an opponent. If you are looking for those sideboard cards, you have to mulligan differently than in Standard, where your sideboard cards slightly improve your deck, but they're not necessarily blowouts. In Legacy, Mulliganing is an art all of its own. There are cards like Thalia that shut down Storm. And if you don't have them as an answer, you need to continue to look for them, or you're going to lose in the first 3 turns against a deck that is designed to kill you very early. In Vintage, you're often looking for extremely specific answers. Leyline of the Void against Dredge is an absolute must, or Ravenous Trap, something else that shuts down that really powerful, really fast deck. In the EDH, mulligans are about constructing your plan, and that often includes ramp to get to higher casting cost spells. EDH games tend to, on average, not always, but on average, be slower, and you get this chance to cast wonderful big spells. And a big mistake that I see people make is keeping a hand full of those big spells and hoping to randomly hit a land drop every turn. Instead, you should be shuffling those big spells away, grabbing ramp into your hand so that you can top deck those large spells and cast them after you've guaranteedly hit land every turn. Tiny Leaders is very different from EDH. Similar formats in theory, but the curve is so much smaller. Ramp doesn't matter. You need to have threats and answers right out of the gate. Looking at your opponent's commander, trying to figure out what their deck's trying to do, and then make sure that you either have a game plan they can't interact with, or that you've got answers to their game plan and a long-term strategy to win. Limited is often more about the land and your ability to cast spells in your deck. What colors do you need early? Are you okay missing a certain color later? Your curve matters a lot. Also, if you have those lower drop spells so that you can get some creatures on the board early, that's very important in Limited. Each format, though, has a different type of mulligan set of questions you need to ask. And I can do a video on each of these different ones if people are interested. But understanding the goal in your format, how fast it is and what your deck is trying to do, helps you craft those questions that you're going to be asking in 30 seconds to a minute as you choose to keep these 7 or ship them for 6 different cards. I strongly suggest practicing. Mulligans are one of those things that you can take the deck by itself, pull up 7 cards, decide whether you would keep it or not, play through a few turns and see how it turns out. If you have any cases that you think are edge, take a picture of them, share them on Instagram, share them on Magic the Scattling. Ask your friends for help. Ask the local pros for help. Looking at a mulligan hand in a picture is very easy to do. You're likely to get a lot of different commentary. Try to figure out who's commenting. What type of a player are they? How strong are they? Find those strong players and reach out to them for commentary. A lot of people like these type of puzzles. If you can find strong players that like giving feedback here, it can be educational for you and fun for them. Anytime you're in a match, write down the 7, 6, or 5 cards that gave you a very difficult mulligan choice. And then, with your deck list, go to a stronger player and ask them for feedback. One of the big things that I have as a takeaway from chess is that you learn best from your own mistakes. If you write down pieces of your own game and then learn how to improve those, they'll stay with you in long-term memory much, much longer. You should always compete with a notebook, piece of paper there, or a device that lets you keep track of notes. Having those notes later and reviewing them is the best way to learn, and mulligans are part of that learning process. Thank you everybody for subscribing to the channel. If you're not already a subscriber, please crush that subscribe button. I'm trying to get to 10,000 here before October, and I greatly appreciate your help doing that. Also, thank you to everybody who's over there on Patreon. We've got a top 10 list coming out for the new Origin set here within a week and a half after the spoilers are out. I'm also working on the July financial and speculation video, a death and taxes video, and a top 20 green EDH cards. If you've got any suggestions or ideas for those things, hit me up on Twitter. I'd love to chat with people over this stuff. Take care. I'll talk to y'all later.